God Bless America, pronounced in Congress by the President of the Russian Federation. And Western specialists flooded all our government institutions, participated in reforms, in the preparation of privatization, and many other things were happening. But many warned about the danger of this course. And what happened in the 2000 elections, I think, reflected the country's desire, the people's desire, to regain its historical essence, its destiny, its national pride. And in December, at the end of December 1999, when Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin publicly handed over power to Vladimirovich Putin, and elections were subsequently scheduled, a new era began. And recently, not so long ago, Vladimirovich recalled how he told Clinton at their first meeting, if we are no longer enemies, if there is no Soviet Union, no Warsaw Pact, no ideological differences, well, and if you don't want to close NATO in this situation, then why not admit us into NATO and we will cooperate there? And, well, Clinton grunted, so to speak, if we translate what happened there into everyday language. Then in the evening, they were somewhere at a G20 summit, and at the evening reception, he said, you know, my guys told me it wouldn't work out. Deception is the foundation of Western diplomacy. It is still that way today. And we can recall 1999, when it was written at the OSCE summit in Istanbul, NATO will not expand. It was written there, in other words, that no one has the right to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others, and no country or organization in this Euro-Atlantic space has the right to claim dominance. And they did the exact opposite. And we will always be ready to talk, but we have learned our lessons, and our relations with the West will never again be what they were before February 2022. And these stabilization forces, in essence, preserve, entrench, and protect a neo-Nazi regime, which is the only regime in the whole world that has banned an entire language and an entire canonical religion. We are used to doing things in a noble way, you could say, in a straightforward way, which is essentially the same thing. We shook on it. We keep our word. Here is a proposal for you. We say we accept it without changes, just as we accepted the Ukrainians' proposals in April 22 in Istanbul, essentially without changes. We are always ready for negotiations, but we will not declare any ceasefires during the negotiation period. The fire will only end when there is a full-fledged, long-term settlement. And finally, regarding the Americans, we mentioned that after Anchorage, how did we reach this point? How did we end up in such company? And what is wrong with the company? Countries that were previously considered strange outcasts by the whole world have become Russia's main allies. And many have the question, why is that? They were considered outcasts by those who imagined themselves the victors in the Cold War and who proclaimed the end of history forever, which is where we started our conversation. Our intelligence officers worked in various countries, heroically defending our interests, but that is primarily about gathering information, you see. But as for staging coups, we never learned that. It's not our method. Sergey Viktorovich, thank you very much for agreeing to talk. My first question is perhaps a conceptual one about the structure of the world. If we used to speak of a bipolar world, and then after the collapse of the USSR, of a unipolar world, how would you characterize the state of the world now? What is it like? It is in a stage of transformation, of deep changes. These changes will most likely take an entire era, so it is not guaranteed that the generation living on Earth now will see the final configuration, if it indeed comes to be, and if it can be formed. Indeed, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you remember, unipolarity was proclaimed almost openly. Francis Fukuyama reflected the aspirations, dreams, and state of Western elites when he said that the end of history had arrived, and from then on, only the Western liberal model in economics, politics, and human rights would be the sole dominant one on the planet. This was perceived differently at the time, but I don't recall our Chinese neighbors commenting on it actively. In our country, it was commented on with enthusiasm in some places, as if we had finally shed the shackles of the communist system. God Bless America, pronounced in Congress by the President of the Russian Federation, and Western specialists flooded all our government institutions, participated in reforms, in the preparation of privatization, and many other things were happening. But many warned about the danger of this course. And what happened in the 2000 elections, I think, reflected the country's desire, the people's desire, to regain its historical essence, its destiny, its national pride. And in December, at the end of December 1999, when Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin publicly handed over power to Vladimirovich Putin, and elections were subsequently scheduled, a new era began. Because I don't think the initiators of the unipolar theory counted on Russia being as compliant as it was under the Yeltsin government. And we must give the West its due. It started not just with a pat on the back, but with creating an atmosphere. In 2001, the president of Russia, Putin, visited the United States for the first time. A year later, George W. Bush arrived. A declaration was signed, you wouldn't believe it, few people probably remember it now, on the strategic partnership between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. And the president reciprocated. Even before Bush Jr., he had been in contact with Clinton. And recently, not so long ago, Vladimirovich recalled how he told Clinton at their first meeting, if we are no longer enemies, if there is no Soviet Union, no Warsaw Pact, no ideological differences, well, and if you don't want to close NATO in this situation, then why not admit us into NATO and we will cooperate there? And, well, Clinton grunted, so to speak, if we translate what happened there into everyday language. Then in the evening, they were somewhere at a G20 summit, and at the evening reception, he said, you know, my guys told me it wouldn't work out. Therefore, the intention was always to keep us close, but not as an equal partner. Even when we triumphantly joined the G8, when the G8 turned into the G7, it was not full membership. Oh yeah, something like that. No, it was a G8 when political issues were discussed, when the West needed to impose political assessments, for instance, on Iran, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Moreover, these assessments went beyond the existing resolutions of the UN Security Council. But as soon as the talk turned to, yes, we participated in meetings of finance ministers, but the most delicate issues of managing the international, monetary, financial, and trade system were discussed by the G7, and only then would they invite our finance minister. And by and large, they would just announce to him that this had been agreed upon. Therefore, the turning point in changing our attitude and in finally understanding and gaining the conviction that the West would not cooperate on an equal footing was Putin's Munich speech, 2007. They all know it very well. Everything that was said back then was based on facts. And besides the dry, convincing, and irrefutable facts, there was also, an emotional component. Because if you watch the recording of that speech, Vladimirovich literally citing examples of how the West was deceiving us at every turn, both on NATO issues and on many other specific crisis situations, was literally asking, with expression, so to speak, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why not conduct our affairs as promised, as recorded in many documents? That's it. But the fact that a multipolar world is a reality and the formation of a multipolar world is a reality. China, the world's leading economy, this is already recognized by almost everyone. Yes, in terms of purchasing power parity, but the growth rates of the Chinese economy are very impressive. Though they are saying now that there might be a crisis of overproduction, that because of what the West has done to its own economies, there will be nowhere to sell everything that China produces. But that is just a technical matter. It is being resolved. But in geopolitical, in geoeconomic terms, giants, such giants as China, India, and Brazil, are rising and rapidly increasing their economic standing, their place in world economic affairs in Africa. Fundamental changes are happening in Africa because it is starting to move away from the neo-colonial model where raw materials were taken and value was added in Europe. Africans have also realized that they're being deceived by all of them. Of course, they rejoiced and enjoyed political freedom, political decolonization. May I ask, but has economic one remained to this day? A clarifying question that concerns many segments of the population. You mentioned that Vladimirovich said back in 2007 that the West is constantly deceiving us, but we still hear this reaction from our country. We've been deceived again. And everyone is asking, why do we still expect not to be deceived? I mean, how much longer can we fall for this? We are, after all, a pious nation. Our people are multi-ethnic, and there are many proverbs about patience, the great patience of our people. The Lord endured and commanded us to endure. But measure 7 times, cut once. Patience is a virtue, and good things come to those. This also reveals our psychology. But it's not exactly naivete in the national character immortalized by our long, long historical events. It is still some kind of hope that, well, a scoundrel cannot be a complete scoundrel, to put it simply. Ilya Muromets lay on the stove for 33 years, also waiting until his services were needed for the motherland. But deception is the foundation of Western diplomacy. It is still that way today. And we can recall 1999, when it was written at the OSCE summit in Istanbul, NATO will not expand. It was written there, in other words, that no one has the right to strengthen their security at the expense of the security of others, and no country or organization in this Euro-Atlantic space has the right to claim dominance. And they did the exact opposite. When we told them back in the early to mid-90s, under Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, when he headed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are his memoirs. Now, by the way, Jack Matlock, again, a former U.S. ambassador to our country, has published memoirs where he clearly confirmed, unconditionally, that it was firmly promised that NATO would not expand if Germany united. But that organization expanded not only into the eastern part of Germany, but also into other countries. We asked, how can this be? You promised, you gave firm assurances. Well, that was just verbal. That they are talking. That's called evading. Then, later in Istanbul in '99, in writing, we see they are still continuing to expand. We ask again, guys, this is no longer verbal, but in writing, at the highest level. They reply without blinking, well, this is just a political declaration. It's not legally binding. Our last attempt, or rather our penultimate attempt, was in 2008 when we said, fine, you cite the politically not binding nature, so here is a legally binding treaty that translates the same OSCE principles signed by your leaders into legal language. They hid in the bushes. They wouldn't even discuss it. The same goes for our final effort to prevent the Ukrainian crisis. In December 2021, our proposal to NATO and the US. Let us conclude treaties on European security in this part of our Eurasian continent. It is sad, but there are a huge number of such examples. So if I move on to Ukrainian affairs, since we have mentioned them. February 2014, February 21st, Germany, France, and Poland guarantee, with the signatures of their ministers, an agreement between Yanukovych and the opposition for early elections, that until the elections, there would be a government of national unity. The next morning, February 22nd, the opposition seizes government buildings and takes to the Maidan. Congratulations, we have created a government of victors. And on those same dates, February 24th, 2014, Hollande, who was president of France, Steinmeier, who was then foreign minister, Merkel, who was chancellor of Germany, and of course, William Hague, Britain's actual minister. Just read it. It's all on the internet. The people have finally taken power into their own hands. Yanukovych has left and no one knows where he is. But Yanukovych was at his party's Congress in Kharkiv. It's another matter that he wasn't exactly welcome there, but he didn't run away anywhere. He was in the country. So then the question is, do we continue to believe them after all this? I am returning to our national character, to the proverbs that reflect our faith in people, if you will, until the very end. But that end has already arrived. It was not for nothing that the president said after the start of the special military operation and after the West, having overcome a certain confusion, firmly set out on the path of pumping this Kiev Nazi regime with increasingly modern, increasingly lethal offensive weapons. And in one of his speeches in the year the SMO began, the president said, also answering questions related to the position of the West, to its treachery and duplicity, he said, we will always be ready to talk, but we have learned our lessons, and our relations with the West will never again be what they were before February 2022. Well, since we've touched on this topic, this week in Moscow, the head of Vatican diplomacy and the CIA director both happen to be in Moscow on the same day. What is happening? Can you answer that question? Visits from the head of Vatican diplomacy and the CIA director are taking place. What is behind these visits? What did you talk about? In both cases, it comes down to the desire of those who came to see us to come and talk. I spoke with the head of the Vatican delegation. We had no secrets. We told them practically everything. The press conference, they, of course, expressed an interest in seeing this conflict ended as soon as possible. They confirmed their readiness to assist in resolving humanitarian issues. Cardinal Zuppi has already visited us a couple of times, whom Pope Francis tasked with facilitating contact on humanitarian issues like the exchange of prisoners between Russia and Ukraine. As you know, our ombudsman, Dania, the ombudsman, the woman, ombudsperson, yes, is in contact with her Ukrainian counterpart, Lubinets, and they have such a business-like language. Depoliticized, it helps, such a style helps to solve problems. And the Vatican expressed readiness to facilitate this, just as Melania Trump helped resolve a number of issues that reached her through various public organizations. And of course, considering the interest of Paul Gallagher, who heads the Vatican Secretariat for Relations with States. Well, he is the foreign minister. Considering his interest, which he regularly emphasized regarding a speedy settlement, I presented him with all the examples that we are discussing with you right now. How he reacted, that we never lacked goodwill. That back in 2014, we supported the agreement that was trampled upon the very next morning to the applause of those who had guaranteed its sanctity. A year later came the Minsk agreements, also guaranteed by us along with the Europeans, Merkel and Hollande, which were completely sabotaged, despite the fact that in 2019, Macron, who had just become president, gathered the Normandy Four with Merkel, Putin, and Zelensky. We adopted another document there, which confirmed the need to fulfill the Minsk agreements, especially since they were approved by the UN Security Council. But recently, Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko said we had no intention of fulfilling them. We just needed to win time to arm ourselves. These, well, plus, of course, the maneuvers of Boris Johnson, and since my interlocutor, Mr. Gallagher, is also from the British Isles, the maneuvers of Boris Johnson in April 2022, when he forbade signing the document drafted and initialed by the Ukrainians themselves during the talks in Istanbul. And what did the Vatican envoy answer to this? I think he understood everything. I would say, he had no counter-arguments except for this general slogan, "Well, we need to finish this as soon as possible." I told him the following: what the West is currently pushing for is to stop where the lines of contact are a truce, not a long-term peace. Moreover, it has been loudly proclaimed that after such a suspension or cessation of hostilities, neither Ukraine nor the West, at least Europe, will recognize the territory controlled by Russia as the territory of the Russian Federation, including in accordance with the Constitution. They will not recognize it. And they even proudly say, well, we need a ceasefire, and then we will restore the 1991 borders through peaceful means. And then stabilization forces are to be deployed on the territory remaining under Zelensky's control. Britain and France are right at the forefront of this very zealous initiative. And these stabilization forces, in essence, preserve, entrench, and protect a neo-Nazi regime, which is the only regime in the whole world that has banned an entire language and an entire canonical religion. Legally banned them. And these bans began long before the start of the special military operation. And how does the Vatican react to this, by the way? I asked the Vatican representative to what extent they perceive these very human rights. Well, the persecution of Christian religions, yes. And he said that it is not good. And I will be honest, and I hope I'm not revealing the secret, he promised, in response to my request, he promised to send the appropriate signals during subsequent contacts with the Ukrainians. And I asked him, because he was in Kiev a month before visiting Moscow, I asked if they touched upon these topics because, well, the Vatican monitors all the ups and downs in the global religious environment, in all world religions, and they couldn't have not known what was happening. He admitted that he somehow didn't have enough time. It's the same thing. I have been speaking publicly about the unacceptability of these things for more than a year. I cite the UN Charter, which states all are required to respect and ensure human rights regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. So this is a direct hit to this very regime. And no one, anywhere, in any proposals, whoever might put these proposals forward, not just voices from Europe, but from other regions of the world, when they call for ending the conflict with such a fair settlement, no one mentions language or religion. Well, this is their position. They will simply choose not to notice. Someone at an event, I won't mention any names, one of my Western colleagues came up to me over a cup of coffee and said, well, this was after my speech where I brought up this topic again. He said, look, once negotiations begin, this will be part of the package. I said, no, this cannot be part of a negotiation package. It is an obligation that must be fulfilled by Ukraine unconditionally. And you, who lead them and run their affairs, bear direct responsibility for this. Today, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article about the CIA director's visit. Allegedly, he flew here. To put it simply, to warn Russia against attacking one of the NATO countries. Well, it was likely about the Baltic states. Trump said it was a routine visit. And there is another version that around August 14th, we asked the Americans, could you please tell us how you are helping the Ukrainians strike our economic infrastructure? And in your opinion, which of these versions is the most accurate? What is the truth? You know, I wasn't there, and we, like the rest of the world, have rules that intelligence agencies follow when interacting with one another. There is nothing unusual about that, and there is nothing unusual about them conducting this work in silence. We also work largely in silence, in diplomacy. But diplomats are obligated by tradition, by the nature of their profession, to say something. Of course, we don't disclose details that are too sensitive, that are being worked on where it is important not to scare off a possible compromise or consensus. But regarding August 14th, yes, something was published. Yes, on August 14th, we allegedly asked the Americans, tell us how you are helping the Ukrainians strike our territory. And was there practically an ultimatum from our side? There was no ultimatum from our side. From our side, it was a question, because leaks periodically appear in the Western press about how the Trump administration, having declared the Ukrainian crisis, Biden's war is now itself providing Ukraine with new financial appropriations, weapons, intelligence, data, and so on. And every time there have been 3 or 4 such cases in the last couple of months, when such information appears, we calmly send it through diplomatic channels to the State Department and ask them to confirm if it is true. And we are still waiting for an answer. We haven't received an answer even once. Not a single response. And in principle, when we talk about the Americans, of course, we appreciate the fact that Donald Trump, from the very beginning, started pursuing a policy different from the Europeans and different from Biden's. He, regardless of the caveats we might have, he did start looking at the root causes. And long before his initiatives, even when he was on the campaign trail, he said repeatedly, forget about NATO, forget about NATO. The Russians told us everything about NATO long before Putin. This is unrealistic. It shouldn't even be discussed. He said that many times. He repeated this before Anchorage and after Anchorage as well. Regarding Anchorage, or in Anchorage rather, we discussed the proposals the president spoke about. Witkoff brought them a week before Anchorage, and they contained certain compromise nuances, but were based on the realities that had developed on the ground. And when I say on the ground, I also include the referendums that took place there. They were based on those realities with small compromises. And when my colleague Marco Rubio said, recently, well, not recently, in June, and I spoke to him later and asked him about it, when he stated after the NATO summit in June that the US cannot be a mediator because we are unequivocally on Ukraine's side. Actually, there was nothing in Anchorage at all. That was our proposal, which was discussed, and then the Ukrainians didn't like it. Well, this is again that topic of how Russians negotiate and how they negotiate in the West. I would just like to ask, does it happen often that presidents meet just like that, without anything? No, you can meet just like that. It's still useful to exchange views, even if there's no document. But for us, since olden times, merchants would strike a deal. They agreed. That's it. No one signs any papers. It's a matter of honor. And it was the same with NATO when we were told something and then they started citing, well, those were just words. There. And in Anchorage, the U.S. proposal was laid out. Putin started by reading that proposal point by point and asked Witkoff, who was present, Stephen, did I state this correctly? He nodded and confirmed everything. And after everything read by Putin was confirmed by Witkoff as Trump's position, Putin said, Donald, there are nuances here, but I accept your proposal fully, only we are ready. If that is an agreement and understanding, then I don't know what an agreement is when, well, right after Anchorage, the Europeans and Zelensky rushed in and hung onto Trump's arms. And as a result, after processing that lasted almost a whole year, in June, at the G7 summit in Aviano, Macron proudly announced, we have buried Anchorage. Trump is with us now. I don't know how this is viewed in the White House, but there was no reaction to these words. Does this mean we didn't do enough, didn't hang on Trump's arms and explain our point of view to him? That's not our style. We are used to doing things in a noble way, you could say, in a straightforward way, which is essentially the same thing. We shook on it. We keep our word. Here is a proposal for you. We say we accept it without changes, just as we accepted the Ukrainians' proposals in April 22 in Istanbul, essentially without changes. That's why, yes, although after Rubio said that they can be intermediaries, we met with him in Manila on the sidelines of the ASEAN event, and then about a month ago, he said that we are interested in resolving the Ukrainian crisis, but we need to look for new approaches. We are ready to listen to new approaches. But in the meantime, we continue to work on the ground. And Putin has repeatedly recalled the situation when, at the beginning of April in Istanbul, they practically reached an agreement, initialed the document, but Johnson forbade it. But back then, Macron called him and said, well, to create an optimal atmosphere for signing the document, make a gesture of goodwill, withdraw from Kyiv. So we withdrew from Kyiv. And 2 days later, when we were no longer there, the BBC arrived and started filming corpses that were neatly laid out along the side of the road in the suburb of Bucha. But even then, Putin said that from now on, we are always ready for negotiations, but we will not declare any ceasefires during the negotiation period. The fire will only end when there is a full-fledged long-term settlement. And finally, regarding the Americans, we mentioned that after Anchorage, well, first of all, at the press conference with Putin in Anchorage itself, Trump spoke in glowing terms about the results. He said that essentially only one difficult issue remained, meaning, as everyone knows now, the part of the DPR still under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. He particularly emphasized in his speeches last August that we are not following the path of some truce that would surely break in a year or two, but the path of formulating long, sustainable foundations for a stable settlement. All our theses were fully confirmed. But if Trump was fully in favor of signing these agreements, yet nothing happened, the question is whether Trump is even in charge, and if he is as strong as he wants to seem. Well, I've spoken with the U.S. president a few times during his current first term, but, well, I haven't played golf with him and can't judge his swing, though those who understand the sport tell me he's a very good player. But I probably won't judge how harmonious or well-structured relations within the Western camp are right now, or who is doing what, or who depends on whom. But the fact is, the United States is, of course, worried that their once limitless power is becoming a thing of the past. And looking at the statistics of their share of the global economy, well, perhaps they only lead in military spending. And even then, they've recently forced Europe to pull their spending up to nearly $1.5 trillion. That is what the U.S. wants for itself in its military budget. We were absolutely sincere when misfortune struck the Americans. And on September 11, 2001, Putin was the first to call American President Bush. He was the first to offer help and express solidarity. Just a few days later, the Security Council adopted a resolution that became the basis for the operation the Americans launched in Afghanistan, with the goal declared to the whole world and enshrined in the UN Security Council resolution of eradicating terrorism and assisting the Afghans in returning to a normal life. Well, in the end, you know that, yes, an entire international coalition was created under this same resolution, and we were sincerely ready to cooperate in various forms. But in the end, it all resulted in the Americans simply deciding to stay there instead of eradicating terrorism, and they remained until the very latest events. And we expressed solidarity primarily because we probably understood better than others at the time what international terrorism was, which, by the way, was actively sponsored in our Caucasus by those same British and some other Westerners. It's good that you mentioned the British, because my next question was about them. So we see that in 2022, Boris Johnson flies to Kyiv. The signing of the Istanbul agreements is derailed. Now, this week, there's a visit from the new Prime Minister, and the British travel to Ukraine quite often. The question is, what is Great Britain's role in this whole conflict? And in your opinion, are the British managing to outplay the Americans right now? Well, Britain's role is the most negative, as it has been for centuries, for long centuries. Well, regarding Russia for sure, but also regarding the majority of other, I won't say partners, Britain's fellow travelers, because it never had permanent allies. And the U.S. is no exception. They always looked a bit down their noses at those Anglo-Saxons who created a state for themselves across the Atlantic Ocean. Ever since the time of Ivan the Terrible, there have been testimonies from contemporaries about how the British constantly tried to do nasty things to our country. One could also recall the Crimean War at the end of the 19th century. During the Revolution, British diplomats actively instigated the state Duma as well. But in effect, they betrayed their own relatives, such as Nicholas II and his family, who were relatives of the English monarch, George V. George V refused to fulfill Nicholas II's direct request to grant him asylum. This was back in the spring of 1917. And then we all know what followed. There was the period of the Second World War, and indeed our allies, the USA and Britain. With Lend-Lease and the Northern convoys, it really helped a lot. And many historians write that it played a nearly decisive role in our ability to hold out through the first year up to the Battle of Moscow. Then a diplomatic game of maneuvering began. The second front, and the impression was created that they were watching the situation on the front, waiting to see which way it would swing, and thinking about which side to choose. Then there was Churchill's Fulton speech. Yes, that is clear. Even before the Fulton speech, there was something our intelligence agencies didn't publish until recently, wishing to preserve the memory of the alliance, which was Operation Unthinkable, which started to be developed by the British together with the Americans even before the end of the Second World War. And it envisioned a massive attack on the Soviet Union. But we still do not forget the period of our alliance. But if this was a situational alliance on the part of our partners, our brothers in arms, in the Second World War, it ended very, very, very quickly. I was actually asking about something else. The attitude toward us is clear. Don't you think that the British are now outplaying the Americans on the, let's say, Ukrainian front? Well, Zelensky is outplaying everyone there. You don't even need politicians as sophisticated as the British there. Look, Zelensky is simply managing everyone. Although, that is his manner, beyond the fact that huge sums of money are disappearing in Ukraine, largely being embezzled, and corruption is flourishing. He is not fulfilling the directives of those same Americans regarding cooperation with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and some special administrative chamber they have there. He simply ignores them and tries to keep these agencies under his own control. But besides all that, in addition to this irritation, there is also frustration with the Ukrainians who have left for Europe and behave as if they are the masters there, creating problems for the employment of citizens in Poland. For example, problems with grain exports, and now they have started transporting it by land into Poland, and conditions for Ukrainian grain have been created there such that Polish farmers are beginning to almost strike. But beyond all these objective facts, Zelensky's behavior, as he travels around the world, is such that everyone is simply expected to listen to him and carry out his orders. Well, everyone is listening, aren't they? Frustration is building, but I wouldn't count on this frustration growing to the point where someone will simply tell him, enough, give up. No, we must not give in to such sentiments, and of course, we must not give in to the attempts that Zelensky himself is actively provoking with the support of Europeans to destabilize our society by attacking refineries, marketplaces, civilian infrastructure, using simple terrorist methods to sow fear. Schools, children's centers, beaches, passenger buses, a huge number of objects that have nothing to do with hospitals, which have no relation to military potential. And the West is shamefully silent, just as the UN Secretary General and the Commissioner for Human Rights are unfortunately shamefully silent. They have unequivocally and firmly taken a side. So since we have touched upon these terrorist methods that have begun to escalate and what they started doing in the Black Sea, receiving our much stronger response, I know that we have people who say how things used to be normal. And suddenly they comment on these things in different ways. Few people say that we started it. Almost everyone who laments what is happening in everyday life, they understand that the West started it, but they are always asking, more and more often asking, well, when will we finish this? Why can't we do it faster? But we are more powerful. We have never had such a situation in history. In World War II, we were, after all, with the USA and Britain. And later, as we victoriously advanced, especially through Europe, our ranks were replenished by other countries that were already pulling their troops out from under Hitler and switching to our side. But this time, and many call this a world war, but in the trenches with us were only soldiers of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Everyone else is on that side. And, well, the fact that Rubio, maybe it just slipped out that the US is not a mediator, they are for Ukraine. This makes the front of the collective West against us universal. You mentioned North Korea. In essence, we now have two allies, North Korea and Iran. And everyone has the question, how did we reach this point? How did we end up in such company? And what is wrong with the company? Countries that were previously considered strange outcasts by the whole world have become Russia's main allies. And many have the question, why is that? They were considered outcasts by those who imagined themselves the victors in the Cold War and who proclaimed the end of history forever, which is where we started our conversation. I remember very well, I've been working in New York since 1994. Back then it was Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin and Andrei Kozyrev was Minister of Foreign Affairs. I attended G8 events when it started to include the Russian Federation. I remember feeling uncomfortable because I categorically refused to sign off on unacceptable wording, and they looked at me like an outcast. I said, listen, why you bring up G8 topics here that are already on Security Council agenda? It's simply unethical. Later, I told them straight to their faces, I understand you want to drag some agreement out of the Russian representative for wording you'll later use in the Security Council to point fingers at us. The West manners are boorish. They were like that, although at the time they still polished them a bit, considering the documents signed with America, like the strategic partnership. But North Korea, what exactly did North Korea do? They declared it an enemy from the very beginning, a major problem. And they reached a conclusion that proved correct. In today's world, the only guarantee is nuclear weapons, especially when surrounded, well, not surrounded, but South Korea, American bases, Japan, and nobody touches them. And Trump recently spoke about North Korea not as a pariah, but about Kim Jong-un as his good friend and how well they go along. And regarding Iran now, when out of the blue, on the 28th, well, before that, in June last year, the US and Israel, in the middle of negotiations, the talks were ongoing. They finished the talks in the evening, agreed to meet in the morning, and in between, they bombed them. The war lasted 12 days, and then February 28th of this year. And now the Americans say, we demand that Iran open the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran says, in return, ease or lift the sanctions, and they will do it. But the most interesting thing is that the Strait of Hormuz was completely open until February 28th. But after that aggression, Iran showed that, after all, it also has its national interests, its national pride, and its traditions. Persian history spans more than a millennium. And only now, if the Strait of Hormuz is to be opened, they are discussing transit fees. But there weren't any until the US and Israel started this venture. By the way, we also don't want a fee to be introduced, but that is a subject for future discussions. I will ask, one of the consequences of the aggression against Iran right now is that the positions of those in the Iranian leadership who say, we warned you, without nuclear weapons, they will constantly harass us, have strengthened sharply. These positions used to be marginal under Atol, who was eliminated, under security aide Lerishani, who was eliminated, and now Iran is saying, vote to talk to them. We want to talk to them. Well, there is no one left to talk to. I don't know anyone there. We killed everyone. What is this? I will ask an unusual question. Perhaps no one has ever asked you this. As a diplomat, do you currently see a threat to diplomacy from artificial intelligence? Two blocks have already emerged. One is the Chinese-American bloc called Pax Silicona, and the second is the Chinese IAI. Well, Sili comes from silicon, as I understand it. Yes. And countries have already started dividing themselves precisely based on which artificial intelligence they use. Countries know, I would say they haven't started dividing themselves. They are being divided. The US sees China as its main competitor. According to some professional assessments that can be trusted, China is moving faster and more effectively in this sphere. Well, considering such a national trait as discipline, the willingness to sacrifice free time and to dedicate oneself entirely to work. And indeed, this Pax Silicona was created by the Americans. They don't want China to be part of it. It was created, well, it was formally announced to establish some cooperation to control the flows of semiconductors and other components that are in one way or another involved in the creation and use of artificial intelligence. But the specific task is to scoop up as many countries as possible under their umbrella and to develop rules for working with artificial intelligence, including its commercialization, including possible dual-use applications up to military ones, so that these rules suit the US. And so they don't allow participants of this PAX to defect to China's side. That's it, roughly speaking. One could explain it for a long time. And in June, the Chinese held their first global conference where they announced the creation of a World Artificial Intelligence Organization. We participated in this conference as full-fledged founding fathers and mothers. And now it is a very critical stage where this concept will be refined and supplemented with organizational issues. What kind of governing structures? Who is the president? How many vice presidents? What auxiliary bodies will there be? A scientific council, and so on. 37 countries already. Russia's 38th, actually, 38. I think the Americans have a comparable number of participants, but this is a serious matter. In principle, we are in favor of this being discussed universally, rather than being split into national, class, or ideological camps. And, of course, the Chinese project, it assumes it is open to everyone. AUKUS is rather a more well-closed affair. But the selling of technologies, yes, and the long-term imposition of technologies, so to speak. So, this will be a difficult process. And by the way, when the head of Vatican diplomacy, Gallagher, visited, share our concern that more and more voices are being raised by scientists with fears about the possibility of controlling the military use of artificial intelligence. On the post-Soviet space, the last two questions. About Armenia, This morning, I believe, it became known that former President Robert Kocharyan has been arrested for 2 months. His son, also yesterday, for 2 months. In fact, we saw Armenian security forces who came to all the structures, business structures of this family, our foreign ministry's position. Well, there is also another president, Sargsyan, under investigation, who was Minister of Defense under Kocharyan, and then later became president. Our foreign ministry's position is that we proceed from the interests of the Armenian people and see how the interests of the Armenian people, which for centuries have been intertwined with the interests of our people. And when always, for long, long periods of time, we were together in solidarity with each other, when Russia has more than once helped out the Armenian people and the Armenian leadership in difficult situations, these interests must, of course, dominate. Now, the current representatives of the leadership in Yerevan are guided by other tasks. The goal of orientation toward the European Union has been declared. A law on starting the process of joining the European Union has been adopted. But when the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, well, they met in May for a summit, they issued a statement calling on the Armenian leadership to hold a referendum and decide who you want to be with the European Union, or do you want to remain in the Eurasian Economic Union. But I think a completely justified request. The norms of one organization are incompatible with the other organization. This has been said many times already, but the Prime Minister of Armenia, Mr. Pashinyan, said, when the time comes, I will decide. Well, what does it mean when the time comes? If you have already passed a law on starting Armenia's accession to the EU. Now, I was reading just the other day, Mr. Pashinyan, said that one can talk about a referendum when we, firstly, submit an application to the EU, when there is a reaction to it, and when a roadmap for this accession is prepared, then there will be a referendum. Well, that, in my opinion, does not speak of very great trust in the Armenian voters and the Armenian people. The choice should be shown honestly, what you are choosing between. Like how you live now, when over the last 3 years, the trade turnover there was more than 6 billion. 1 year, the turnover was even 12 billion. And in general, the country developed at the expense of the Eurasian Economic Union. Doesn't what is currently happening in Armenia remind you of other events? Events like those in Ukraine in 2013, when there was a similar push toward the European Union. The formal pretext for the start of the bloody Maidan was Yanukovych's request not to cancel the association agreement, but to postpone it, because the reasoning was quite obvious. If Ukraine had become an associate member of the EU, it would have had practically zero tariffs on all goods. And within the CIS free trade zone, it also had zero tariffs with us. And there were no customs borders. They simply didn't exist. My point is that we simply told them that if you open your border to Europe, we will have to close our border, because by joining the WTO after 18 years, we fought for tariff protection and we achieved it. And if you open up wide, everything will flood into our country. I don't know if Russia went through this same path in its relations with Ukraine. How can we avoid making the same mistakes with Armenia now and avoid breaking relations or severing ties? On our side, everything has been done, including all our positions and all the advantages Armenia gets from being in the Eurasian Economic Union, and all the benefits it gets by receiving energy from us at 3 or 4 times cheaper than the prices in the European Union. I assume they have good economists there, and we have regular contacts between our deputy prime ministers. any issues that interest the Armenians can be discussed, including the situation with the South Caucasus Railway, which is under concession to Russian railways. And we are surprised to hear how these issues, if they have indeed arisen, are handled well. You should tell your partner about how you are thinking regarding this matter. Instead, public statements are made saying, we will take it away, it's actually ours, and you owe us $2 billion. I understand that in addition to assessments based on economic analysis, this also stirs emotions in the hearts of our citizens. And I am no exception. But one could also recall Moldova, where the elections were held with such fierce participation from the European Union. And yet, even that didn't help win a majority of votes from Moldovans living in Moldova. Only 44% were in favor of moving toward the EU and electing Sandu as president. And everything was decided by the polling stations that were opened in Europe. Over 200 stations. Whereas in Russia, which has the largest diaspora, only 2 were opened, and over 100,000, or maybe 150,000, votes were simply wiped out. People weren't allowed to vote. And now, by the way, the European Union, I believe they already have one mission there that was countering hybrid threats during the June 7th elections. They are already annoyed with some peacekeepers still remaining there. They are talking about new peacekeepers, about the need to deploy them there. That is sad. That is sad. Especially since in the case of Moldova and Armenia, the EU is directly interfering in electoral processes, trying to exert influence, though perhaps not as crudely as they did in Romania a year ago, where no campaigning could help. And back then, the leaders simply pulled candidates from the race after the first round without any explanation, and that was it. That's why, well, surely in Armenia and other countries that flirt with the European Union, there are analysts, I have no doubt about it, smart, observant people who should probably finally understand what the European Union is and what benefits they actually hope to get. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the concept of the post-Soviet space emerged. By 2026, in your opinion, won't this concept have already faded into history? Is it still relevant? Well, I think it went down in history a long time ago, just like many other associations that were once empires. The Soviet Union was probably an empire, just like the Russian Empire. The borders were even larger in some parts of our territory, but post always refers to something left behind. One must remember history, but in today's political science, there was a time, and we must not forget it, is different. That is for historians and for educating young people, for schools and institutes, so that these traditions and spiritual values of ours, which grew over centuries, from generation to generation, are not forgotten. But for modern politics, the term we used 3 years ago in the latest version of the foreign policy concept in March 2023 is near abroad. It is neutral. It is not Soviet, not imperial, not democratic, but rather there is a near abroad, and here live people, and every nation has the right to choose the form of organizing their life, their state, well, to put it loftily, to determine their own destiny. And we have never imposed anything on anyone. All these problems that have arisen around us, if you look at the root causes of each crisis, they were all brought in from the outside. Returning to Britain, to the Europeans, Europe has been doing this since 2004, the first Maidan. In Ukraine, when they forced the Constitutional Court to make an unconstitutional decision and hold a third round of elections and hold on. Because Yanukovych won the second round, not Yushchenko. They held a third round, which isn't in the Constitution by decision of the Constitutional Court. Even back then, we worked with Yushchenko. We worked with Timoshenko. We respected the choice of the Ukrainian people, even a choice made through fraudulent methods employed by Europeans. We have nothing to reproach ourselves for. Perhaps we are reproached for our soft power being too soft and that we should have been a bit tough. Yes, I heard that in Armenia back in May. Yes. That Russia is no good at soft power. It doesn't work out. Well, since soft power has now clearly degraded into direct methods of interfering in internal affairs, perhaps, yes. Well, we certainly have experience in subversive work from pre-war times and during the war. Our intelligence officers worked in various countries, heroically defending our interests, but that is primarily about gathering information, you see. But as for staging coups, we never learned that. It's not our method. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.